everyone. Kara Oosterhuis here with RealAgriculture.com. We are back here today with another Real Ag Live episode. I am excited to be here and excited to get right into it. It is an agronomic, if you listen to Real Ag Radio, you'll know about Agronomic Mondays, but we are now doing an Agronomic Tuesday here on Real Ag Live. And I'm going to bring in here today's guest. I have here with me Matt Chapple, who is a market development agronomist with Pride Seeds. How's it going today?
It's going great, Kara. I'm looking out the window here. It's 18 degrees in southwestern Ontario, and spring is definitely in the air.
Absolutely. So you're starting to, it's the time of the year you likely have your varieties chosen, you have your fields chosen, but we're starting to think about getting into the field, especially when it comes to our soybeans. What are some of the things you want to keep in mind?
Yeah, I think really setting up for success in the 2021 growing season really comes down to a lot of things we did last fall. Um, how did our crops come off last harvest? Did we get an opportunity to do some fall tillage? Did we get an opportunity to do some fall fertilizer applications? And of course, did we get the right seed chosen for the right acre and take really that prescriptive approach for every acre in our operation?
So let's talk about some tillage things right now. What sorts of considerations do you have in mind when it comes to looking at spring tillage?
Yeah, I think if you want to focus on soybeans this year, I think there's going to be a lot of soybean acres and a lot of opportunity for big soybean yields this year. There's really three main soybean growers, in my opinion. There's the no-till. They want to build organic matter. They realize that their soils are maybe prone to erosion or crusting. There's those that believe in banding fertilizers, strip tilling, maybe some minimum tillage to work in some fall fertilizer. And there's those true conventional growers that are really doing a lot of tillage in the fall, almost to the point where they can do a stale seed bed in the spring and really set that up for some pretty easy planter operations in the spring. When we look at those different methods, I think those spring tillage guys with the recent dry conditions, they're really looking at a different, weed spectrum when it comes to spring preparation. Those that are strip tilling or maybe minimum till, they're able to maybe turn on a dime and take the season's warm temperatures or cold temperatures in stride and look for opportunities to plant possibly earlier or later, given on how April and May shape up as we move forward. Those that are no tillers, they seem to be very patient guys. Primarily growers that really understand how important their soil biology is and not necessarily ready to push the window on planting dates. And that no-till operation is is a really economical choice for maximizing the yield potential and return in soybeans.
Lara's got a question here. She says, for those strip till or no-till growers, how much chaff spread from the previous harvest affect soybeans?
Yeah, particularly if we look at a no-till environment, I think that those that have the best success setting up for their planter to do a good job in the spring, they leave their stover high. They aren't necessarily running a chopping head. They're keeping the residue more in the row and allowing the planter to work between last year's corn rows as much as possible, whether that be a strip till or a no-till configuration. And if we've chopped all that residue from last year's big corn crop and spread it between the rows, it really is a detriment to establishment in our soybean populations for the upcoming growing season. So we hold moisture, we stay cooler longer, and often a lot of issues for planter operation in the spring.
Now, you had talked when you're considering tilling or not, you talked about weed management. Now, here at Real Ag, we have anywhere from a first-time grower to an experienced grower. If somebody's just kind of looking at growing soybeans, they're only in the first couple of years, how competitive are soybeans when it comes to weeds? Or do they stand up pretty well?
Well, there's a reason why we have herbicide tolerant soybeans these days. We continue to have a broader spectrum of weed pressure in our soybean crops, and we've typically done well in terms of herbicide management and managing tough weeds in our corn crop. But if we look at a conventional system, typically we've done some tillage in the fall, maybe quite aggressive, where we uh, maybe kept the seed bank in the upper layer of the soil and maybe destroyed some of those fall and winter annuals that are continuing to germinate. And we can go in later with the herbicide application and control a lot of those weeds. In terms of a no-till environment, we really are, we run the risk of having bigger perennial weeds being established ahead of planting. Things like Canada fleabane or even bluegrass. Those things can be established and cause some issues ahead of a no-till seeding opportunity. So we need to consider a powerful upfront soybean burn down program with multiple modes of action, particularly with the residual herbicide in the mix.
And Lindsay's asking, she says, what's the plan for herbicide resistant Canada fleabane in soybeans? And she's writing that she's shuddering because we know it's not good.
Yeah. I think I felt like years ago with my father and I farming in Kent County, I felt like being no-till soybean growers that we were one of the first ones on the block with Canada fleabane issues. We seemed to be there was a high population in our wheat ground, from our soybean crop, transferred into our wheat crop. We set it back with tillage, and then we really worked on controlling it after the wheat was off for our future corn crop. But ahead of a soybean crop, I really think that there's some powerful data from Dr. Sycamore in Ontario that references things like Aragon, Sencor as a great mix for knocking back that Canada fleabane ahead of planting that soybean crop. And we know how powerful and important it is to start clean and stay clean for those soybeans to get up and out of the ground and set a good stand early.
Now, what other sort of considerations are you keeping in mind when it comes to soils? Before we actually even get that plant in the ground, what else are we looking for?
Yeah, most importantly, I think we talk about corn yields and top corn growers and how they know their soil fertility inside and out. I don't think we pay attention to it enough ahead of a soybean crop. In the past, soybeans have kind of been that crop been left to scavenge. Our big fertility program ahead of a corn crop, maybe we do a min-till or a no-till. We come in with our soybeans and we hope that they can capture that P and K, that residual P and K that's in the soil already. When we take our soil fertility levels seriously ahead of a soybean crop, we're able to mitigate those things, have a plan, and really get the most out of our soybean crop as we head into a season. So whether that be a fall broadcast, which is actually kind of the best option for soybean yield potential, or even a spring broadcast to try to get our P and K levels up, and most importantly, making sure we have what's available to produce the most that we can on our soil. Critical levels for soybeans being around minimum of 20 to 30 part per million on phosphorus and at least 120 part per million on potassium are pretty important values to keep in mind when we think about setting up for maximum potential in a growing season. So offsetting that, having the needs in place for that crop, I think, and really setting our bar higher can help us even offset the risk of Mother Nature throwing wrenches at us and taking away potential.
Speaking of Mother Nature, planting conditions. What sorts of planting conditions are optimal for soybeans, and which ones do we really want to avoid?
Yeah, I think we learned a lot last spring. The spring of 2020 was interesting in southwestern Ontario. It was the end of April, early May, and we were quite dry. We didn't have a lot of snowfall. things melted pretty good, but we had some relatively cold soils to the point where we had big nighttime temperature swings. We had cold rains in the forecast. We had snow events in the forecast as we looked at Mother's Day weekend last year. And those things all kind of proved to be detrimental to establishing soybean stands. You know, ideally, if we look back at that, we would say, we can push the window on soybean seeding when conditions are dry, as long as, we have a warming trend ahead of us. The first 48 hours, much like corn establishment, if we have 48 hours of good weather coming ahead, put the beans in the ground, we can sustain a bit of a stand loss early season because we have the potential to make it up through, those beans that are there, really branching out, filling the rows, and making up for that or compensating. Of course, we can do a lot of things right. We can have good base fertility, but if we don't get the planter pass right, if we're trying to mud in soybeans and we don't have good seed to soil contact, we don't have good down pressure, we don't manage our residue, meaning that we're hairpinning or pushing corn stalks or other residues down in the seed trench, we're going to do a poor job. And soybeans too have proven that they have to be maintained at a consistent depth. So, all these things are really playing into having good soil conditions early in the season, really being a half an inch depth into that soil moisture profile, and trucking on from there.
Now let's talk about that first drink of water the soybeans get. Imbibitional chilling is definitely a thing. Do you want to talk about why we need to try and avoid it?
Yeah, soybeans are a pretty tender little plant. They really do like that warm drink early in the spring. And when we get that, we can typically expect to see, 20, 30% stand loss from putting beans in that growing environment. We really want to avoid that because we can optimize our seeding rates when we don't put them into that situation. If it's the difference between planting 160,000 or 180,000 into a cold window, I think we're far more suited to wait a little bit, drop the population, and know that we can get a good, well-established stand. There's some pretty solid data from OMAF for last year that said, planting into a window where the temperature can drop to -4, so dropped our stand by over 20%. So soybeans really are susceptible to early chilling injury or stand losses from that.
Now you're talking seeding rates too. Do you wanna touch a bit on what happens if we have too high of seeding rates and too low of seeding rates? Why it's kind of important to really make sure we have bang on for your field?
Yeah, I think a lot of that comes down to variety selection as well. If you've got a slender plant profile, you're targeting sandier soils, maybe a more upright plant stature. You can maybe you would keep that plant population in check to probably about 150 to 160,000 on a 15-inch row. If you're on that clay soil, you're likely pushing up the population higher because survivability or pushing through the soil surface is a real risk. When we plant earlier, it's been noted well in our data that plant population isn't as imperative. That 120,000 seeds per acre can really flex bush out, create more nodes per acre, and those be valuable nodes per acre ahead of summer solstice, because soybeans are such a light sensitive product that that we can take a greater stand loss earlier in the season. But as we get into late May in southwestern Ontario, it's even more important that we increase those seeding rates by at least 10%, pertaining to our tillage and our soil type. And that 10% increase really is to create competition within the row, force those plants up out of the ground faster, force them to branch out and compete because, ideally we want to get as many nodes per acre as fast as we can to try to, maximize yield potential on soybean crop.
So I know you're saying maximizing as many nodes as you can, but is there a certain number when it comes to plant populations that you're kind of really targeting for?
Yeah, if you look at lighter soils, I think we can really do well with the 120 to 140,000 populations. If we start talking on the clay soils and we know we can't plant really early, we need to be aiming for a planted population of 200 to 220,000 as we get into an early June timeframe because those soils maybe are more poor drained. They don't have that soil organic matter that can help us out in a lot of ways. So really tailoring the variety and the soil type around your planting population and your tillage practice is pretty important. I think that really the historical sweet spot has been around that 150 to 160,000 on 15-inch rows. I have seen growers on 30-inch rows that deal with white mold consistently. They have populations as low as 100,000 to offset the risk of disease, and they really have done well. They've attained 60 bushel yield across their acres by dropping a lower population and mitigating that risk of disease. But on the contrary, those guys that are dropping 200,000 and experiencing 20% stand loss from soil crusting, snapping off cotyledons in those late times of the year. They need to maintain that higher level. It also goes back to a study we did and looked at the ability of different varieties to branch out or flex. Varieties that flex are going to be well suited for those lower stands, whereas those that are more fixed and don't flex at lower populations, we can continue to see the max ROI on our seed up into that 160, 180 plants per acre.
Now, let's talk diseases. Of course, it's always a consideration, always a concern, but is there anything we can be doing to kind of mitigate diseases in that early planted soybeans?
Yeah, if we're thinking about going into cooler soil conditions, probably a little wetter, there's not a lot of dust flying behind the planter. We really have to consider seed treatments. I think they are probably one of the most valuable tools we look at in terms of protecting us from future disease popping up. Things like Phytophthora, Pythium, and most importantly, SDS. SDS and Phytophthora are root rot pathogens that we can see really rear their head as the crop goes into late reproductive stages and tries to put his energy into pod fill. And then we often will see, premature senescence, leaf drop, and of course we can't fill those final pods that are trying to establish themselves late in the season. So, offsetting that risk of planting earlier with the right fungicide seed treatments. One that we really have seen a lot of power behind has been Saltro in the last couple of seasons. That SDS seed treatment, regardless of the presence of soybean cyst nematode, we have seen more than 3 bushel advantages to using Saltro in those SDS prone acres. That being said, if you have a history of SDS, it seems to be a very good option, a very useful tool to combat that risk of SDS because growers that have experienced SDS, they know how quickly they can lose a lot of power behind a strong soybean crop, and if that's the difference in 10 bushels an acre, really warrants the current economics of growing soybeans.
Yep, absolutely. So when we're talking diseases, which one of the diseases really is the most imperative? Or I guess which I'm using the wrong words, but which one causes the most damage and can be the most detrimental to your soybean crop?
Yeah, it depends on the growing season. I think SDS is a very powerful disease and it can really take the top end off We've also experienced some significant losses with white mold in the past. And white mold really being when you have that lush canopy, that really robust plant, a really good stand, high fertility soils, and we turn into a high humidity environment later in the growing season, to the point where you maybe have some lodging. That white mold can, take off 20, 30% yield potential pretty quickly. SDS, on the other hand, that's typically from, variable spring conditions, a lot of cool, wet conditions, wet feet on the soybeans. And that too, can be about 20% hit to our yield potential in a given year. So both of those are kind of top of mind. If you've ever experienced them, and going into 2021, they should be a number one priority to manage this growing season. And keeping those kind of cultural practices in mind on what we can do by widening our rows, dropping back our population, or even waiting till we are into a warming trend, or drier soil conditions can help offset the risk of those diseases.
Now, when it comes to planting, we've talked about populations, seeding rates, things like that. But what about depth? What sorts of recommendations do you have for seeding depth?
One of the most common things I get called about every spring is around, why aren't my beans coming up evenly? They seem to be trapped in the ground, they're lagging behind. And there's a couple things that I see when I go there to these field sites. Is we look at things like, inconsistent seeding depth. Maybe the seed trench hasn't closed, but it's either that, it's getting late in the season and the soybeans have actually been planted too shallow. Usually those beans are just hardly under the soil surface and sitting in dry dirt. Those poor little soybeans are only about an inch deep and they're praying for a rain. That is kind of one of our biggest problems with getting the soybeans up and out of the ground consistently in the spring. So for me, that is more that we need to be at least half-inch into moisture, and more importantly, finding the sweet spot for your practices. And most commonly, that being around that inch and a half depth of seeding. If we go too far the other way and we start getting 2.5, 3 inches deep on a soybean crop, soybeans just don't have the vigor to do and push through that. 2.5 inches deep, we see variable results and emergence, very poor consistency and stand establishment, and often to the detriment of final yield. So that 1.5, half-inch into moisture. If we're getting late in the season, maybe you push it a little more to 2 inches, but you hope you don't have a pounding rain on that that's going to lock things in and crust over and set back that stand.
Absolutely. So now part of your job as well is you guys are conducting trials all through Ontario as well. What sort of trials are you guys doing this year, and what are you looking forward to in the growing season?
Yeah, a couple things I've been building on over the past couple growing seasons has been working with a particular grower. He's been doing a couple things with his air seeder, using the air seeder to band MAP and potash in the fall rather than broadcasting. So significantly cutting his broadcast rates of fertilizer ahead of his soybean crop versus that banded, and looking for efficiencies there. If we can maintain that yield level by utilizing, putting less fertilizer per acre, but in a concentrated strip. So he's using that strip till approach with his air seeder. So that's been one cool thing we're using. This is going into year 3 now of looking at fungicides on soybeans by population, by environment as well. So what we've got now is building on a data set actually that 2019 showed about a 2.5 bushel advantage to using fungicide on soybeans. Last year, we saw about a 5.4 bushel advantage to using fungicide on soybeans. And I look forward to quantifying again this year. So those trials were set up where we did static strips of population. We replicated fungicide application in 200-foot intervals across the site farm length trials so that we could pick up that data by the yield monitor and extract that data utilizing our friends at Veritas Farm Management and really weighing those static strips of population so we could understand the variety's response to population in those no-till environments, but also seeing if we could quantify or replicate a fungicide response within those strips. So that's been a really interesting learning tool. That helps us build population recommendations and also has a look at, given the growing season of the yield environment, whether or not these different varieties and plant structure on soybeans can yield a consistent response to a fungicide application.
And if producers are looking to find some of the results from some of your guys' trials, is it available for the general public?
I think we can contact your Pride Seeds agronomist and we can have that discussion, or your Pride Seeds dealer, and we can tailor those needs to meet your farm and build some strategies around getting the most out of your soybeans in 2021.
Absolutely. Is there any other recommendations you'd like to give to growers if they're looking at getting out in the field in the next couple weeks?
Well, I think soil conditions have to be right. As much as we all get the itch when it's 20 degrees out, I think we have to keep in mind the risk associated. What is the forecast in the next 2 weeks? You know, can we do an effective job with our planter to get across acres? Can we manage and get the most out of our seeding rate that we're dropping early in the season? Because we all experienced a lot of cold issues last spring, and it's not the way to set up for maximum yield potential going into 2021. So
Absolutely. Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time today, Matt, and I look forward to chatting with you as the season continues.
yeah, thanks, Kara. I enjoy the chat. Thank you.
Absolutely. And thank you, everyone who tuned in today. It is always fun to have you along for the ride. If you want to tune into some more Real Ag Live this week, tomorrow, Sean Haney will be your host. He'll have Megan Murdoch on. And Thursday, I will be back and we'll be talking pulse agronomy with Sherilyn Phelps of Saskatchewan Pulse Growers. So be sure to tune in for the rest of the week. We are not on Friday due to it being Good Friday, and but we'll be back on next week again. So thank you, everyone, and thanks for getting real and getting connected.